until we hear about that, I do want to go to our next caller here. Let's go to Joshua, who's calling in from Virginia. Hey, Joshua, you're on Truth Wanted. What's going on?
Hey, Dan. It's been a little while. I called in about a year ago. We chatted once.
Cool.
I was just listening to that last conversation. There's just so much. Have you heard of the tournament style system in chicken farming?
The tournament style system. I feel like that was also on Super Size Me, and I don't recall what that is.
It got referenced in a sequel that there are problems in the there's problems all over. I wanted to get to a definitional thing that you might really dig into, and feel free to look this up and criticize me if you think that I'm wrong about this.
Okay.
But in my experience, something that got brought up earlier, propaganda is not necessarily inaccurate. If you actually look up the definition, propaganda, for the most part, is accurate information, and misinformation is inaccurate information. Propaganda is essentially the manipulation of information tended to be like accompanied by a omission of important facts meant to like weave a narrative.
So
so it's more the manipulation of the facts to represent them in a way that, and then you get to something called agitprop or agitated propaganda, where it's still sometimes even technically true statements, but like taking words out of context or fully misrepresenting what someone is saying intentionally to try and get like a rise out of them.
Yeah, I think, I looked it up because I was curious as to what the dictionary says, or at least one dictionary. And on propaganda, it says information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view.
Correct.
Yeah, so
nowhere in there does it say that the information itself is inaccurate. It's specific.
Well, that would be inaccurate and misleading, I suppose, are probably not synonyms. Although in this particular case,
did it say inaccurate?
It says biased or misleading.
Right. Bias exists kind of everywhere.
Right. Yeah, and I guess
I don't see biased or misleading as inaccurate.
So,
kind of by definition, for me, for something to be misleading, it has to be accurate. Because if it was inaccurate, you would call it inaccurate.
So I know a little bit about this. I went to college for communications. I have a degree. I have a university studies degree with one of my concentrations in communications. And in part of that, we do study propaganda, the means and tools of propaganda, how propaganda gets propagated, stuff like that. And my understanding, okay, of the history of propaganda, especially in this country, is that propaganda you might as well call synonymous to advertising, because really that's what propaganda is. Yes, and propaganda can have a right. Propaganda can have a bias. If I'm putting out a flyer to you about the ACA and telling you what it is and what we do here and the things you can volunteer for,
has a bias.
You can absolutely call
corporate propaganda.
You can absolutely call that propaganda. There's nothing in the definition of propaganda I would say that would call that. Now, is it intentionally misleading? I don't think so. I think propaganda can be an informative thing, and that's just a word that we use to describe it. But propaganda in modern times, because of events like World War II, where we had propaganda, especially from Germany, right, who had a ministry of propaganda, as well as, I mean, our country did too.
Well,
we just didn't call it that, but
Russia had propaganda.
And Russia as well, where we found, hey, they were putting out information, but it wasn't all super accurate, right? There was definitely a kind of a slant to it. And so now the word propaganda in our lexicon has this connotation to it that says, oh, there's something about that information that may not completely be true. So yes, on one technical level, you're right.
It's the lexicon. The lexicon's been flipped in a lot of different terminologies.
Well, I don't know that it's
I'm just kind of saying that the term misinformation, if you were to actually grade hierarchically, we should be looking at the term misinformation as more damning than the term propaganda.
Well, let me ask you this: is a lie of omission is a lie of omission still a lie?
Absolutely.
Okay, so
Absolutely. In fact,
so you can tell the truth, 100% tell the truth, and still tell it in such a way as to misinform somebody.
Well, an example that I think is really relevant, or a jumping off point that's really relevant for this show in particular, would be how people deal with certain religiosity. That there can be historicity to events that may still not lead to conclusions that people seem to draw. And so in the colloquial term, a lot of things that people may draw from a particular religious text, we may look at that as someone that doesn't believe how they believe and think of it as that same kind of nature of there being something that's missing.
I'm trying to follow you, but can you give a specific example of what you mean?
Well, there's a lot of times in the Bible where someone, say, misinterprets something. Living in America, I'd say that there's a lot of times where we deal with things that certainly feel a lot like propaganda to us as atheists. So I'm kind of just explaining something that maps to something more familiar.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just trying to...
In that it's not necessarily that all the information isn't accurate. There are historical accounts in the Bible, but that doesn't mean that everything that's written in the Bible is accurate.
Sure.
Yeah.
And in some ways, I guess what I'm even trying to get across is that there's a lot of times where people read something that might be somewhat accurate about, say, a particular health article talking about, the correlation of eating oranges to cancer, and they come away from that thinking that because of the statistics that are being argued that oranges actually cause cancer. The statistic is not flat out inaccurate, but we might still look at that and say that this is dangerous because people are drawing the wrong conclusion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it might.
I think there's a lot more information out there than people realize that fits into that category of being misleading.
I think today we're much more aware of especially with the rise of fake news, which is not quite the same thing as propaganda. I will agree. Mm-hmm. But I think that we're becoming more aware of it because it's more in our face, and we can definitely see the effects of it. Yeah. Today, I don't think people know what to do about it in many cases.
One thing I will say is,
understood.
Propaganda. In my understanding of the word, usually there's an agenda behind a propaganda. There is a idea that the sender of the propaganda is trying to, well, not necessarily even a bias. I'm just talking about there is a point that someone is trying to persuade you of when they give propaganda. And I'm making this point because, if we're talking about a news article from a reputable news source, it shouldn't necessarily count. I don't think we would traditionally count it as propaganda because we understand at least a legitimate news source, the purpose of the news is supposed to give an informed, give a population an informed, fact-based account of a sequence of events or a series of events. Now, that's not to say that news people don't use certain events or use certain wording or whatever to weave a specific narrative, but we do kind of have this ideal of what a news should be, that it shouldn't be persuasive of any particular point.
Right, it should be the facts and just the facts, ma'am.
Now, if you look at agenda-setting theory, that might be different. But anyway, go ahead, Joshua.
Yeah, no, I know all about agenda-setting theory and the Overton window and all that different kind of stuff. But I can definitely say that what I'm thinking of when I picture propaganda is not somebody sitting in a room with a red pen going through story after story and Xing things out kind of thing. It's all a lot more subtle, and I think it has a lot more to do with how various industries interconnect with one another, and it's sort of more all about a large collective job security in the sense that I think that a lot of what results that we as the population look at the news and say, well, this looks like they, chose to not report on this very much and they chose to report on this very much. And we draw away from that, well, they're greedy because they're aiming for, clicks. But that's how they eat.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that there isn't a relationship at play there that means that the news becomes sensationalized. However, it's also not really providing much of a solution to the answer, because to simply say, well, it's greed, is not quite answering the entire question.
No. They're fulfilling a market. There is a market for news and for specific stories.
Yes. And, we kind of make choices about what we want to do as far as how society is organized.
Sure.
And, that was originally kind of what my call was even about, had to do with how all that stuff is connected, how markets tie in, how kind of a general, if we had gotten to it, was going to discuss a theory that I have about inflation. It's not really a theory, it's like the theory of evolution. It's not my theory, and it's not like a theory as in an idea. It's just a theory that kind of describes inflation and describes how these different things interact. And
are you an economist?
I'm a student. I've been doing this for a long time now. I admit health and wellness is the one area I'm just not that well versed in. I even know a lot of statistics around the healthcare industry.
Well, you said inflation, and now we've jumped. I'm sorry, Joshua, you lost me. We were talking about inflation. I asked if you were an economist, and then now we're back on health. I didn't follow.
Well, I just, I'll let me try to steer the conversation a little bit here.
I was referencing that I don't know much about health specifically, but I know quite a bit about most industries.
And I certainly don't know a whole lot about health. I'm not an expert on that either, but I know a thing or two about the news. Yeah. No, I get you here, Joshua. It is interesting too, because in general, first of all, most people don't even read the news. They read headlines. That's that's another thing people don't consider. And I realize that all the time now, because that's the first thing you see when you're scrolling through your feed and stuff. And 9 times out of 10, if I'm looking on Twitter and I see a news thing, I'm not going to click on that article. I'm just not, unless I'm really interested.
Me neither.
Because there's so much news information out there, it is impossible for one person to consume. If you look at the New York Times and you have the app for that, by the time you're finished going through each section of those news, the day is going to be done.
Yeah.
And you have to get it started all over again.
Yeah.
So.
If I share or retweet,
I think your average.
Go ahead, Josh.
Oh, just it's been a long time since I did any kind of average reading. I have a lot of sources that I've developed over time that I read kind of mainstream news, but only ever so often. I tend to not have enough time in the day.
Yeah.
I trade on Robinhood during the day, and I try and do some influencing at night, and I do debates and chats and stuff like that. I can't trust New York Times as far as I can throw them sometimes. It's, again, when you're reading online, it really depends on the person.
Well, let's talk about that really quickly. We've talked about a lot of things here, and I do want to wrap things up. But I am curious, what is it about New York Times in particular that you don't trust?
Well, it's not. Well, it's not as if it's New York Times in particular.
Okay.
A lot of the larger. It's not a problem with any one place.
So it could be Washington Post or the New Yorker.
Well, there's even people at Washington Post that from my opinion, are just fine.
Okay.
And it's all just kind of my opinion as far as reading article after article after article from different people. It's not as if one outlet is good and one outlet is bad.
Okay.
There might be 77 writers that write for Washington Post, and I think that 3 of them write good, honest articles, and that there might be 70 that are kind of cruddy and 4 that are just terrible, kind of thing. I've tried to explain that to people too, that especially when you're talking about reading written articles online, people kind of read 2-3 articles from a site, and they kind of say, oh, I disagree with this article. Maybe I shouldn't read anything from Washington Post.
That's true.
You can sift through, and they have more than one author. They tend to have authors from a wide range of, so essentially that's how I would approach that, is that
it's like if you heard one ACA host and you're like,
sifting through all those different people.
I didn't like this ACA host, and that therefore the whole ACA is stupid. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, when I look at an article,
I found Matt Dillahunty to be like a little too like angry, and then I found Talk Heathen and got back around to where I'm fine listening to Matt Dillahunty now.
Yeah. So one of the things I look at in an article is how quickly do I get to the source, the real source? Can I get to it in a single click, or do I have to? Where am I going to click and oh, look, it's another article and then another article, and then I kind of go, probably not worth my time to go any farther. So I always want to try and get to the original research or the person who said it, preferably a video. You know, how quickly can I get to that first level, you know, what they're actually talking about? How quickly can I get to the source of that article?
Well, epistemology helped me a lot. I started first, like on my little like personal journey. I actually started with epistemology, and the street epistemology guy. I'm blanking on his name now.
Anthony Magnabosco.
That's right, Magnabosco. Yes, I remember literally watching that, and I basically took that approach, and I said, well, let me see what happens if I take this to economics. And then I took that to Robin Hood, and then I like own most of my house now, and I'm only like 24.
Hey, that's pretty cool.
I had a certain level of success, and now I'm trying to figure out how I can do that for something other than just making myself money.
Well,
it's fun, but it's also like there's an incredible amount of morality that you have to make a decision a lot of times, whether or not you want to, as an investor, work with both hands tied behind your back and a blindfold on, or whether you want to be the bad guy.
Yeah. I can see what you mean.
You guys were describing, like, it is not so much greed. It is the nature of the system, which you can call that greed. But,
that's true.
I mean, it's like getting mad at the guillotine for gravity.
I see what you mean. Market forces. if we have a system that's relying on market forces, then how can we? You know, it's the system is just going to perform the way that it is. But I want to go ahead and end this call here, Joshua, so we can get some other folks. But thanks again for calling back into the show. I really do appreciate it. And over a year ago, wow, that's crazy that you get the call back for that. I do want to remind people